all day?
It's all day.
Mm-hmm.
It was fine yesterday. Because I checked the thermostat and it said cool.
No, no,
It's not that hot.
you're warmer than normal, is it? Yeah.
Here comes
Usually I
Aaron.
get chilled, you know, when I come in.
Hey. I always started doing tours.
Oh, no, but you're right.
Hey, stranger. How are you? Where have you been? No, you haven't been here. Take care of yourself. Yeah, excellent. Come right here back. Shave. Can't hurt anybody with the weather. Well, thank you.
Replenish the ranks.
Yeah.
Surgeons.
Yeah. We will.
Yeah. So many. Oh, right. Yeah, it's just on that type. Oh, is that the hearing that's on in the House? On C-SPAN?
Which one?
The Tillman hearing?
Oh, the Tillman, yeah.
Government reform, oversight, and control.
Don't we already know what happened?
People lied.
Trying to find out why it happened and embarrass everybody.
Again?
They should have brought in the Walter Reed crew too, just to rip it all out.
Just get it over with.
Yeah.
Walter Reed, they're having a press conference later this week on that.
Yeah, tomorrow. Many old stories.
Just a minute.
The news stories how well they're getting treated.
Yeah.
Love the script. Thank you.
I tempted to put my legs up.
I know,
Just
Jeff.
since there's so much room. Spread out.
Well,
There's
3
no
minutes
Pets
ago, I
camera.
was
It would
like
be
the
great.
only person.
Yeah.
Where's the
Right.
Pets camera when we need it?
Where were you this morning?
Caught in traffic.
Sure.
No, Casper caught the same traffic and he got here late too.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
I'll shoot the briefing next time.
That depends on how good questions you ask.
No,
That's
it does not.
There are no boring speakers, there are only uninterested audiences.
Good afternoon and welcome. It's my privilege to introduce to you somebody that has not been to our briefing room before, Mr. Richard Douglas, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counternarcotics, Counterproliferation and Global Threats. He has offered some of his time to come down to talk about the department's role in counternarcotics, the counternarcotics mission, and to give you an overview of what the department does to support that effort and to take some of your questions. So with that, let me turn it over to you, and thank you for your time today.
Afternoon. Well, I'm Richard Douglas, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counternarcotics, Counterproliferation and Global Threats. My office oversees the department's role in countering narcotics trafficking and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction around the world. Today I would like to talk about the department's work with our combatant commanders, as well as with U.S. and foreign law enforcement agencies and authorities to stop narcotics trafficking. Then I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. So here's the key point. Our office's role is to make sure that the combatant commanders have the support that they need so they in turn can help responsible law enforcement authorities both in the United States and abroad to oppose narcotics trafficking. And we certainly face some sobering challenges in this task. So the department has some pretty robust authorities, some pretty effective authorities in order to bring to bear the competencies that it has in this struggle. And I'm going to give you some examples. The department is authorized and competent to do detection and monitoring of narcotics traffickers. And in fact, this is a task that's explicitly committed to the department, both in statute and in the National Drug Control Strategy. The department is authorized to do information sharing, not only with U.S. law enforcement agencies, but also with foreign authorities, which is a little unusual. And then the department is authorized to train and build capacity of U.S. and foreign authorities. And in the U.S., typically this would be the National Guard. Overseas, this could be national police authorities or specific counter-narcotics police, depending on the country. So our strategy is to help our combatant commanders, most typically Southern Command and Central Command nowadays, to address the narcotics threat in what we have come to call 3 zones. First, the source zone, in other words, where the narcotics are produced. Second, the transit zone, the areas of the world where these things transit on their way from the source to. Third, the arrival zone, which in the case of the Western Hemisphere, in our case, is the United States. Let me talk about the source zone a little bit. In the Western Hemisphere, the primary threat, as we know, has been cocaine from the Andean Ridge, primarily from Colombia. And compared with a decade ago, Colombia has made enormous progress. We think that under President Uribe's leadership and with U.S. logistical, training, equipment, and infrastructure support, the Colombian government has reduced safe havens for narco-terrorists and increased its presence in remote areas that in the past have not been governed at all in some cases. It certainly has degraded narco-terrorist organizations and enabled efforts to reduce narcotics production. So the Department of Defense, principally through Southern Command, is working to help the Colombian government assume responsibility to provide for itself the kind of support that the United States and the Department have been providing to Colombia for a number of years. The Department is also working with foreign law enforcement agencies, not only in Colombia, but in other parts of the Western Hemisphere too, to address transnational trafficking from the Western Hemisphere now to Europe and Africa, because we're finding that narcotics traffickers are able in some cases to not only transit the Gulf on their way to the United States, but transit the Atlantic Ocean on their way to Africa and Europe. So I'll talk a little bit about the transit zone now in our hemisphere. The foundation for Southern Command and DoD efforts in the Western Hemisphere transit zone, which generally is the Caribbean Sea and the Eastern Pacific, because that's where most of it comes up, is an organization in Key West called the Joint Interagency Task Force South. Some of you may have heard of this place. It's called JATF South for short, Joint Interagency Task Force South. It's located in Key West. And for us, it's really a model of interagency and international cooperation. JATF South is commanded by a U.S. Coast Guard admiral, and in that sense underscores its importance to civilian law enforcement and the DoD role in supporting civilian law enforcement. JATF South coordinates assets such as radar, surface ships, and aircraft that the Department and other U.S. government agencies, such as Customs, as well as foreign governments, provide to detect and monitor illicit narcotic trafficking through our transit zone, not just in the Gulf, but also in the Eastern Pacific. JATF South shares information it develops through a system called CNIS, which means the Cooperating Nation Information Exchange System. CNIS terminals generally are in locations around the hemisphere. We have several in Mexico, for example, where we actually share radar tracks with the host government so they can see where the ships and aircraft are coming as they leave South America. We also have 12 foreign liaison officers located in Key West at JATF South. So these foreign officers can help us with our interdiction efforts, not only in the hemisphere, but also in their countries of origin. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, JATF South is also beginning to work on transatlantic narcotics trafficking activity. As a result, we do have allied nations such as Britain, we have Holland, we have France, some other countries that aren't necessarily located in our hemisphere. Moving up from the transit zone to Mexico and Central America, on land, Mexican drug trafficking organizations nowadays have made Mexico the leading transit country for cocaine and heroin consumed in the United States. It's also Mexico is also the leading source country for marijuana and methamphetamine. In fact, the gravity of this problem has led Mexican President Calderon to give high priority to Mexican counter-narcotics efforts. And in our office, we're very eager to work more closely with Mexican authorities, as well as with Central American governments, to build the capacity to counter trafficking and transit through Mexico and Central America. Moving north to the arrival zone, the United States, I'd like to talk first about National Guard counter-narcotics support, because this is really the key component of what we do physically here in the United States. In fact, it's our primary tool for supporting counter-narcotics efforts domestically. The National Guard has been providing support to federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies since 1989. And in fact, some of you, if you've ever crossed from Juarez, Mexico, into El Paso, Texas, you may well have seen uniformed National Guard personnel on the border conducting vehicle inspections inbound, in some cases outbound. The Guard's efforts have been crucial to interdiction of cocaine, marijuana, ecstasy, precursor chemicals, and methamphetamines coming into the United States and transshipment of illegal drugs through the United States. So using department resources with the support of our office, the National Guard has, for example, helped identify domestic methamphetamine labs and has helped federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies arrest narcotics manufacturers, traffickers, and distributors. And a very important thing that the Guard does, and you may well have seen some of these programs yourself around the country, they have outreach programs for young people to try to prevent use. And they generally go into junior high schools and that sort of thing. So we want to talk a little bit now more broadly outside the Western Hemisphere. The same model, the source, transit zone, arrival zone approach, we use this in other parts of the world. And I'll talk about Afghanistan in this context. Afghanistan, as we all know, is the source of most of the world's illicit opium, about 93%, and probably supplies almost all of the world's demand for illicit heroin. Worse, the Afghan narcotics trade hinders development of the Afghan economy and undermines development of Afghan democratic institutions by providing extremists, terrorists, and government opponents with resources to oppose the central government. In support of the U.S. government's 5-pillar plan for Afghanistan, and the 5 pillars are public information, alternative livelihoods, eradication, interdiction, and justice reform, the department is working to increase the capacity of the government of Afghanistan, as well as neighboring transit zone countries in Central Asia, to stop narcotics trafficking. And specifically, I'm going to give you some specifics about what we're doing in Afghanistan. We're training and equipping a specialized Afghan interdiction unit that has Drug Enforcement Administration mentors to directly address trafficking. We're developing an Afghan intelligence fusion cell, a communication system, a number of bases of operation, and an Mi-17 helicopter squadron to support the Afghan interdiction unit. And the helicopter squadron is very important because of the need for air mobility in a country with extremely rugged terrain. We're also supporting a border management initiative in conjunction with the Department of State, which will assist in hindering the flow of drugs leaving Afghanistan and importation of precursor chemicals needed to turn opium into heroin. We're also providing tactical training for the Afghan border police. And we believe that, in our experience, this has already reduced casualties during confrontations with narco-traffickers at the border. Now, we have other efforts underway in countries around Afghanistan, such as Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. And the idea is to do similar efforts to build capacity on the other side of the border so the Afghan and bordering authorities are able to cooperate and work better together. And we can talk a little bit about that too if you'd like. So I think I'm going to close with that. We've kind of given you a tour around the world of what our office does in very broad terms, and I'd be glad to answer any questions you may have.
So can we talk a little bit more about Afghanistan and in particular what legal authority the U.S. or DoD, U.S. forces have there to interdict and possibly eradicate opium crops? Like, just to ask baldly, why can't U.S. forces just wipe them out? Why can't we just burn them up?
Well, I think the first thing we should keep in mind is the U.S. forces in Afghanistan respond to, in the main, counterterrorism concerns. And I think the Central Command and the Joint Staff here can give you a much better explanation of how the two work together. But the fact is, there is an order, there is authority for U.S. forces to cooperate with the Afghan authorities, and that's really what this is all about. It's giving the Afghans the capacity to fight this problem themselves in appropriate circumstances. When, for example, there is support needed or in extremis support needed or certain types of air mobility needed in order to move people around the country. And in fact, U.S. forces are already doing this. In fact, I think it's fair to say that the support we're getting from the U.S. combat forces for what our office is responsible for trying to achieve has been very good, and it's getting better. But at the end of the day, there are three components to the struggle against narcotics in Afghanistan. Primarily, and number one, the first priority is the Afghan government. And that's what we're about. We're doing our best to build capacity to allow them to undertake this mission on their own. We're doing it through building competent police forces that are well-trained and well-equipped with things like this aviation squadron I've mentioned, and thereby relieve the burden on the coalition, relieve the burden on ISAF and NATO, and pick up the burden themselves. Second, ISAF is also now an important part of this picture as they've come into Afghanistan in the last year. We think that we're also getting good cooperation from ISAF. I was in Afghanistan about 3 weeks ago and had a chance to meet with the ISAF commander's Counternarcotics staff. I believe that they've established good working relationship with the Drug Enforcement Administration, which is essentially the mentoring force for the United States in Afghanistan. And I think ISAF is doing what it can within available resources and operational requirements in order to provide the support needed on the counter-narcotics side. And last, but certainly by no means least, our combat forces in Afghanistan, as I said, they have been, in my opinion, extremely helpful to the effort. They've done everything that I'm aware of that they've been asked to do by the Drug Enforcement Administration and by extension by the Afghan government. And I think that at the end of the day, when the Afghan government is itself in a better position to be able to pick up the load, it's going to take a lot of pressure off of our people. And I think that's really what we're hoping to see.
Just quickly follow. So is it a matter of capacity in the Afghan, or lack of capacity in the part of the Afghan government, or do you perceive perhaps a lack of will, because it is, after all, a revenue-producing crop, however illicit it is, and or is it a suitable substitute that can be fielded at this time, apparently?
Well, in my experience, I visited Helmand Province last year and went down and talked to the governor just during the eradication effort there. In my experience, I think that there is quite a bit of political will on the part of the Afghan government to deal with this problem. I think President Karzai has been very explicit about it. I think he understands it, understands the threat that it represents not only to the stability of his government, but to the future of Afghanistan, economically and as a society. So, granted, there are problems. I think there are situations where we've seen some questionable support for what we're trying to accomplish. But in the main, in my opinion, there's no question that institutionally the leadership is on board. Yes, there is a lack of capacity. That's why we're there. One of the things we've been trying to do since our program started in Afghanistan about 3 years ago was to build that capacity that not only will allow them to sustain the pressure on the narcotics traffickers, but also take pressure off of our people. And I don't think there's any question about it. We've made a lot of progress in Afghanistan. We've got Afghan pilots flying Mi-17 helicopters now, trying to support DEA missions. And you know, we're still at the walking stage, but we're getting there quickly to where the Afghans themselves are going to be able to pick up a lot of these missions. We've got a long way to go. The challenges are there, but the fact is we're better off than we were 3 years ago when we started the program. And I think there's certainly great cause for optimism that the Afghans themselves, as we continue our training programs, are going to be able to deal with this mission. Yes, sir.
You keep talking about the Afghans themselves dealing with it, but
what happens in Afghanistan really creates a problem here and in the other destination countries. So first of all, isn't it something that the United States should be willing to go ahead and do, at least in the interim? And secondly, are you doing anything on the softer side of it in terms of finding and introducing alternative crops, convincing people not to grow the opium, and making it so that the first time they see the Afghan government isn't when they come to destroy their livelihood?
Okay, just to kind of start with the beginning of the question, a small technical point. Most of the opium and heroin leaving Afghanistan goes to Western Europe. So it sort of begs the question, why are we there? Well, the answer is because we understand the importance of Afghanistan as a stable democracy with a government able to exercise governance over its own territory, because we've seen what happens when it's unable to do that. The short answer to your question is yes, there is an effort. One of the 5 pillars that forms the broader strategy for Afghanistan is to find a way to introduce alternative livelihoods. That's really more of a State Department lead, but we at DoD are most definitely interested in it because we think it does have an impact on what we're doing. There's really not a lot of attenuation, and it certainly is a measurable impact. But there's no question about it. I mean, one of the main pillars of the strategy is to find a way to wean the farmer off of opium poppy production, make it possible that farmer to support his family without having to turn to an illicit crop, without having to depend on narcotics traffickers for loans to get seed, and without having to live clandestinely in a way, when I think polling has shown that they would much rather not have to do that. So again, it takes time. The State Department, I know, is working very hard on the Alternative Livelihood Program. We are part of the bigger picture in formulating strategy. We've had good vision into what state is doing, and AID and other programs. It's an international effort. It's not just the United States. We have a lot of support from Europe on alternative livelihood programs. And I think everyone agrees that while certainly the counter-narcotics and counterterrorism pieces of the overall picture are vastly important, without good solutions on alternative livelihoods and general economic development, it's going to be very difficult to achieve what we all want, and that is, at the end of the day, a free, stable, healthy Afghanistan that is not a national security threat.
Could you talk a little bit about the National Guard on the border with Mexico, in basic numbers, what they're doing right now, and then also the fact, with so many Guard troops fighting in the global war on terrorism, do you have enough Guard to actually fight counter-drug in Mexico right now?
Sure, I can talk about that. At this time, we probably have about 2,500. And let me just say, the best place to get the absolutely precise numbers is the National Guard Bureau. But based on what we do in our program office and the kind of coming and going we've got about 25 people down, or 2,500 people down on the border now. And it's a mix of different state units. Texas, New Mexico, California, and Arizona, I think, have been down there most recently. But in the first place, let me just change a little technical fix to the question, which is a good question. We don't have National Guard people in Mexico doing any kind of enforcement, so to speak. In fact, really, the National Guard, their job is not to do law enforcement, strictly speaking. Their job is to support law enforcement. And what's happening on the border is just that. We have people on the border working in all kinds of different capacities. The key unifying theme, though, for what the Guard does down there is that what they bring to the table must be militarily unique. It can't be something that law enforcement can do on its own. So there are many things that come to mind. Intelligence, information gathering, certain kinds of aircraft with sensors that local law enforcement isn't able to do. In addition, they're doing engineering construction projects along the border, a whole variety of things that generally the requests that they're able to fulfill sort of bubble up through local authorities on the border or through the various law enforcement agencies like Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, that sort of thing. we need some help with this aspect or that aspect of border security. And as I said, we got about 2,500 people down there. These people are being funded out of the department's central transfer account for counter-narcotics. And if I can just kind of move to your question about the demand on the Guard, it's a very important question. And I know that General Blum at the Guard Bureau thinks about this 24/7. In fact, I spent some time with him about a week ago, not only talking about our program, but just the general state of the Guard. And I had the opportunity to serve with the Guard quite a bit when I was in Iraq. But I can tell you this. The people that are down on the border with us or working in our National Guard state programs, and we have state programs in every state, they're volunteers. They love what they do. My last trip before I was mobilized and went to Iraq was to El Paso, Texas, where I met with the Texas State National Guard. Took an informal poll in the room, who here has served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Many hands went up. Many hands went up for other operations too. And the thing about it though was you could feel the enthusiasm and the great desire of people to be there. In our office, our mission is a very demanding mission. It's a very challenging mission, and it probably always will be as long as there's a demand in the United States for narcotics. But we're extremely sensitive and careful about the demands that we place on the Guard because we're certainly aware, and I am personally aware of the demands that conflicts in Iraq place on these people and their families. So again, we have a very good relationship with General Blum and the Guard Bureau. I think he would probably tell you the same thing. If he doesn't, let me know. But and as I said, we're very sensitive to the demands on the Guard and the additional demands created by our mission. But so far, in my experience in this job, we haven't had any lapses or difficulties or inability to do our mission. In fact, I think it's just the opposite. The Guard recognizes that it's an important mission. They also recognize that it's a critically important training opportunity for Guard units that get involved with counter-drug work and have always been very enthusiastic about meeting these requirements. So. Yes, ma'am.
Can you just kind of break down what monopolizes your day or your week? What in your office, is Afghanistan the biggest threat that you guys are working on right now, or is it U.S., Mexico? How does it sort of break out as far as the biggest threats?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I think in our office probably the three things that we spend the most time on, or that I spend the most time on, and if I can just throw a little commercial message in here, I mean, this is the best job in the Pentagon. I've got two portfolios, counter-narcotics and counterproliferation, that absolutely must get done. And it's a nice feeling to come into work and know that we're really making a contribution that matters. So you hit a couple of the big ones, certainly Afghanistan, because of the fact that not only do we have a counter-narcotics challenge there, and it is a big challenge, we also have Americans engaged in combat and coalition forces engaged in combat. And me personally, I mean, that's a key priority for me. It's the #1 priority. Having spent time in Iraq, and I kind of have a different perspective now on that. So close behind, of course, is Colombia. Colombia is, in many ways, although many challenges remain, a huge success story. The Colombians have done some incredible things in their relationship with the United States in the last 5 or 6 years. But the fact remains, we still have challenges there and we have to deal with them. That's on the counter-narcotics side. Over on the counter-proliferation side, which is, I know, not the subject of this briefing, there's plenty to keep us occupied. And if I can just give you an example, I've returned recently from a meeting in Auckland, New Zealand, on the Proliferation Security Initiative, which is one of the president's priorities. And that's kind of how we spend our day. And it's an interesting mix. We've just reorganized our portfolios. Prior to the beginning of this year, prior to my deployment in Iraq, the portfolios were separate. I had only counter-narcotics. And counter-proliferation and counter-narcotics were brought together in a reorganization here in policy at the beginning of this year. because the objective is to find the good dynamics between those two areas and try to capitalize on them, and also to identify gaps that perhaps we could fill over time and make it easier to deal with both threats.
So it's fair to say that Afghanistan monopolizes, the narcotics problem in Afghanistan monopolizes the largest, or represents the largest narcotics problem that you face. Is that?
Well, the number one narcotics problem we face is demand in the United States. I mean, let's face it. If we could get a handle on demand in the United States and Western Europe, then Colombia and Afghanistan might not loom so large. But, you know, it's a small point to make, but I don't see it as monopolizing my time. I mean, it's what I'm here for, and it's what I want to be doing, because at the end of the day, I think if we're successful in what we're trying to do, it's going to be hugely important for the country, not only for us, but for Afghanistan and other countries. So.
More.
What's the financial nexus between narcotics and terrorism? Do you know how much money terrorist groups are making?
Well, in general, generally speaking, we know from our experience in Colombia that, for example, that FARC is essentially a drug trafficking organization. I mean, FARC's income is based on drug trafficking. And as far as actual numbers, I'm not trying to dodge your question. It's not possible to say with any real certainty because FARC doesn't file a financial statement. But we know that in the first 3 months of this year, around $500 million worth of drugs and other material were interdicted or seized. You may recall in March a very large cocaine seizure off the coast of Panama by the Coast Guard, valued at somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million. We saw a very large money laundering operation in Mexico that was valued in the neighborhood of $200 million. And then another operation in Cali, Colombia came in at about $80 million. So you're looking at $500 million right there in value. We know we're talking about large quantities, and it kind of goes back to the capacity building issue. We knew here in the United States back in the 80s that many of our policemen in South Florida were outgunned by the narcotics traffickers. And we took measures in our own country to try to better arm our police, to try to better arm public safety forces in order to deal with this threat. In places like Colombia, in places like Afghanistan, where, at least in the case of Colombia, we have an advanced infrastructure and at least a solid capacity to build on, we still need to help. We still need to make it possible for the public safety forces to deal with organizations that appear to have huge reservoirs of cash. And in the case of the FARC, to reiterate, we're talking about a drug trafficking organization that makes its money off of trafficking. In the case of Afghanistan, I mean, the president said it in February, the Taliban makes money off of drugs. The Taliban uses money to buy arms. The Taliban uses money to pay Afghans to attack their own government. I don't think there's any question that that nexus exists as far as actually getting a handle on how much. I wish I could be more specific for you, but perhaps ONDCP or DA might be able to provide you with a better estimate. Yes,
There's a figure there of how much opium, how much of the share of the world's opium that Afghanistan produces.
about 93%.
Does DoD have a sense of how much opium is produced? Do you know roughly where those fields are, and what percentage of that capacity to produce that do you think, or can you estimate, has been reduced over the past 3 years? And what do you need to get it done? More equipment, more resources?
Well, as far as actually estimating how much poppy is under cultivation in Afghanistan, the State Department has, for a number of years now, worked very hard at trying to come up with a good estimate. And it's not easy. I mean, it's a vast distance. It's hard to find assets that can do that kind of, that can give you a precise look at exactly what's growing where. Afghanistan's a big country, but I think it's fair to say that in reliance on the State Department and reliance on other organizations that are making some estimates about how much poppy's out there, like the United Nations Office of Drug Control, that sort of thing. I think our people have a fairly defensible idea of how much is out there. As far as what we need in order to take care of it all, the combatant commander for us is in a sense the oracle on what it's going to take to deal with the threats in theater. In the case of, and this is generally speaking, okay, in the case of Afghanistan, we rely on the combatant commander. We also rely on law enforcement authorities such as the Drug Enforcement Administration to tell us what we DoD need to do in order to give them the best support. And I think DEA is very good at estimating what it needs. DEA has some incredibly effective training teams that go out to Afghanistan, work with the Afghan police and the Afghan authorities, not only in Kabul, but outside and other parts of the country, to get a good handle on the scope of the challenge. Based on the input that we get from DEA, we think that have been pretty successful in providing them the wherewithal that they need in order to do their mission. Now, that's not to say that their requirements are not going to increase over time. I mean, I would expect that as the Afghan public security forces grow and their capacity increases, there will at least be, in the short or medium term, some kind of increased requirements on DoD, simply because there are more Afghan cops doing more in places where they need to go, whether it's for eradication or strictly traditional kinds of law enforcement operations. But to kind of summarize, I think that it's not really possible at this point to say, if I had $100 billion more, I could take care of this problem in a week. I mean, there's so many variables: Afghan capacity, Afghan ability to actually go out and do meaningful law enforcement operations, Afghan capacity to actually go out and do eradication operations. And I do understand from the State Department that they're doing much better this year than they did last year on eradication, manual eradication. So these are the kinds of variables that we look at. But my charge, is to be as responsive as we possibly can within available resources to the combatant commander, to the DEA, and by extension, the State Department also, and by extension, the Afghan authorities to deal with the issue. Because at the end of the day, it's an Afghan fight. It's Afghanistan's future, and it's Afghanistan's fight. And that's where we're there. We're there to try to help them pick up the burden as a government and shift some of the burden away from our people and hopefully lift the problem.
It's an Afghan fight, but the Taliban is getting most of its funding from the sale of this stuff.
It is. Taliban's getting a lot of funding.
With that, we conclude today's briefing. Thank you for joining us.
Sure.
Thank you for coming today. If you have any other questions, please let us know.
what we are saying and what we are doing are the same thing.
Are you satisfied that the system in terms of the longer care, the aftercare, given not only the wounded and disabled soldiers and Marines, airmen, whatever, but also the veterans, are you satisfied that that system is not broken?
I'm never satisfied because even for the parts of the system that are working well today, you need to have constant leadership to ensure they continue. And the Secretary and the President have both put in place, from the Department standpoint, everything that the Department is responsible for from the time a troop is wounded till the time we hand them over to the VA care. And from the President's standpoint, the continuation then from the turnover from DOD to VA and the continuation of that. That is all being looked at as it should be. There's no doubt in my mind that there'll be things found that need to be fixed and that we are all committed to fixing it.
The last comment, I would just add this. My view was that when we found the problems that we did at Walter Reed, which we considered the jewel in the crown, if you will, I became very worried that there were other bureaucratic problems elsewhere, and I worried especially about the handoff from the Department of Defense to the Veterans Administration and so on, and that's why I am so supportive of an effort of the Dole-Shalala effort that looks at this process end to end, as I said in my remarks, from the time a soldier is wounded on the battlefield until he or she is either returned to service or is discharged and ends up at their local VA hospital or back at home, to make sure that looked at from the standpoint of the soldier, that, and not from the bureaucratic standpoint, that the quality of attention and care through that whole spectrum is what it should be. And I'm concerned that it's not.
And I guess what surprises many people is that the bureaucracy is surprised that there were these problems.
You know, I've checked off this and here, go over my survey with me. So, yeah, go ahead, Don.
I'd just like to say that it's not about the data. The data that are collected will be used for statistical analysis. This is about getting to each soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine who has an issue and helping that person and his or her family. So we don't want it to be anonymous. We want to know who is having problems and to directly address those problems with them. So the data will be collected, but our aim is to get to each of the people who are coming back from combat and address their personal issues.
So in these reassessments, person will sit down, I mean, in the case of most of the services, not the Air Force, but they'll sit down with somebody, they'll go through this questionnaire, and at the end of that, if they see that that person's having certain problems, then they will be counseled as to...
They'll be referred at that point.
Yes.
They will be referred to...
A wide variety of places. They can go...
advised to go see a doctor.
Well, a doctor or a family social worker or someone who can help with the specific problems that are identified. They're actually pinpointed. If they're family problems, then they can go to a family counselor. If they're more personal problems, more psychological problems, then they might go to a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or another mental health professional. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Or if I might, just to put one point of clarity. The survey is accomplished utilizing the web, but each survey is assessed by a provider to look at that survey to see if there are any indicators or issues that need to be addressed. Then that is in addition to the annual face-to-face preventive health assessment that we do, in addition to our annual fitness testing. And given that our deployment rotations are somewhat different than the other services, being 120 days, we have greater periodicity within our cycle that allows us to really keep a good track and awareness of an individual's health. So the web-based survey for us was the best tool in that continuum but there is a great deal of face-to-face that occurs, and certainly if there's any issues that are raised, that is very much a one-on-one assessment.
Great. Okay. Yes. Let me
Just
maybe one more.
Just to clarify, this pilot program, you have no initial either results or indications from this initial pilot program? Is that?
That's correct. Our interest was far more in determining how it best worked to meet the need of the individual, how to best structure the process, the interface, engaging the command, educating people. It really was, the pilot was not about producing data to analyze. It was really about structuring the process to best engage the individuals.
And just one other quick thing on just on something a little off the subject here, on the bird flu.
Yes.
Are you, obviously this is also something that people are concerned about, vaccines has been a big issue about whether soldiers shouldn't take them, whether they want to take them, whether they should be able to choose. What are you doing in preparation for that eventuality as you move on?
We're doing quite a lot, and today's forum is probably not the best to go through all the things that we're doing, but we are working with the combatant commands, with the Joint Staff, my office, the Assistant Secretary for Homeland Defense, many people on developing and finishing, in some cases, plans that are nearly being finished. We're already near finish. Preparedness and response plans. We're stockpiling Tamiflu, antiviral medication. We expect delivery of the first lots of the new vaccine starting in February. And we're working closely with the Department of Health and Human Services to make sure that everybody's educated. There's a variety of things that we're doing, and maybe there'll be another time when we can go into more detail on that. But we feel pretty good about where our progress is. Let me take one last question. Yes.
So just a little more prosaic. Is there any difference between the way you're administering this program for active duty and the reserve components?
Good question. We're reaching out to all active, reserve, guard. And the way in which the service is received might differ slightly, but the survey tool, the instrument, the interaction will all be very similar for each component. Yes.
Will you also be trying to reach the people who've already separated from service?
Possibly. But that will not be the first priority. Obviously, as we implement, we want to reach those, as we indicated, with the most recent deployments, and work through all those that have deployed.
Can I just get a point of clarification?
Yes.
Who exactly is it that evaluates these surveys, these questionnaires? Are they medical personnel?
It would be a medical professional,
and
yes.
then if it's determined that there's a problem with someone who's filled this questionnaire, it's referred, or do they go to the individual, the soldier, the service person, and tell them that they're going to refer them?
Well, it's a face-to-face interaction, and as General Raubush said, even with the Air Force approach, there is a provider that's evaluating the survey tool and will personally interact with each individual. It's a discussion to determine the best type of service, the best level of support, whether it's a referral to a mental health professional, referral for a medical problem, or referral to family support, or what have you.
If it is a referral to a medical health professional, does the service person have the option of denying the referral? I mean,
sure. I mean, we there's freedom for all of us, but we know that the vast majority of people follow up with their appointments as they're guided to do.
So
Thank you.
Just let me walk you through the Marine process, just to make it real clear. The individual Marine or sailor would fill out the questionnaire privately. The hospital corpsman or general medical officer usually assigned to that unit would review that form separate from the individual, who would then have a face-to-face, about a 15-minute conversation about the responses. If, as General Kiley said, all the responses were negative, I'm feeling fine, we would make sure that that was the case just by, as I'm doing with you, looking in the eye. If there were positive responses saying I need help, then that would be explored further. If it's something that general medical officer could take care of him or herself, they would do that. If not, they would refer them within the military health system to a provider or to someone else in the Marine Corps Community Services or the chaplain or wherever that help would be best received.
Yeah. Let me just close by saying one thing, and that is we appreciate your interest in this. We really do. We want to reach the broader medical, the broader military community, service members, their families, and certainly you'll write your stories however you think you should write them. But this is a positive effort. We believe it's been received well so far, and it's being done to help support our service members and their families. So.
Sir, can you say why suicides are down 50% in the military? Do you attribute that to anything?
I think I spoke to that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.